Thank you all so much for tuning in today. We are glad that we can keep in touch and support our community, even if we can't be together in person. Please be aware we are recording this service and it will be posted on our Facebook and YouTube pages. Also, we are turning off all mics and cameras for most of the service to minimize distractions and to eliminate feedback from open mics. You will not be able to turn these back on yourself. During hymns, some attendees' mics will be turned on to create our first virtual choir. If you would like to be a part of this group of volunteer singers, or you would like to perform a song during service, please let us know by emailing Lisa Mayor Price at services@mvuuc.org. During Joys and Concerns, you can request to have your mic and camera turned back on to share by clicking the Raise Hand button at the bottom of the participants window. We recommend that you go ahead and show the participants window now by clicking on Participants near the bottom of the screen. We recommend you also click on Chat near the bottom of the screen so that you may view and send messages to others during the service. These instructions apply to computer viewers only. It's a little different on iPhones and iPads or some kind of tablet and camera, phone. Mics and cameras will be restored at the end of service for the MVUUC coffee hour. If you'd like an order of service, please look in the comments in the chat box or see the email sent this morning. We joined together this morning to seek justice, equality, and fairness in the world. Our hearts are touched by the human need we feel around us, whether far away or within reach of our hands. We come here to be together because this is how we believe our lives are best lived, in questioning and in conversation, in compassion and in service, in gratitude and in joy, in companionship and in love. It is good to be together with you this morning. Please take a moment to think of all your friends at MVUUC, greet them with a comment in the chat box, and remember that you can still reach out to them via email, phone, social media, or video chat. Physical distancing does not need to mean emotional distancing. Let us support one another. Take a moment now to greet people via chat. Visitors, as we are a diverse group with varying interests and beliefs, our services are varied in format, tone, and topic. We encourage you to view several services to gain a good understanding of our congregation. If you'd like to receive our weekly email newsletter, please email us at news@mvuuc.org. MVUUC remains committed to supporting our members and friends during this difficult time of social distancing. For that reason, we are coordinating assistance with groceries, phone calls, and other needs. If this sounds like something that would be helpful to you, please send an email to sac@mvuuc.org with your name and what kind of assistance you would like to request. Now is the time for announcements. Announcements can be sent ahead of time to services@mvuuc.org to be read. If you have an important announcement now, you can raise your hand by clicking the Raise Hand button at the bottom of the participant box in Zoom. Then we will announce your name and turn on your mic and camera so that you may make your announcement yourself. Lisa, are there any announcements today?
No, I don't have any. Thank you.
Does anybody else like to make an announcement? If you would like to make an announcement, please raise your hand.
I'd like to make an announcement if that's okay. There are two things that the Social Action Committee would like to kind of put out there for everyone's consideration. The first is that you've probably seen that we started our garden, our raised beds, which is really cool, and I invite everybody to stop by and check them out. But we're also looking for donations of gardening items if anybody has any extras lying around. So we're particularly interested in things like tomato cages, gardening trowel, and maybe any decorative items that you want to contribute. This could be a nice sort of community thing that people can donate items for. So if you're interested in doing that, just email me at SAC, that's S as in Sam, A as in Apple, C as in cat, at MVUUC.org. The second announcement is that I'm going to be organizing a regular phone tree. So some of you know that we have done that in the past as a sort of irregular thing, but I want to make it more regular. So if you're interested in participating in the phone tree, which would involve just, calling 5 to 10 people per week, depending on your preference, I'd love to get that organized so that we can all stay in touch with each other. So if you're interested in doing that, contact me the same way. Just send an email to sac@mvuuc.org. Thank you.
Thank you. We also have, Noelle has an announcement. Go ahead, Noelle. Sorry, having some technical difficulties, trying to unmute her, just a moment. I think we lost her, so we're just going to go ahead and go on.
Okay. The chalice will be lit today by Megan Ranciere. Please join me in reading the words for the chalice lighting that appear as a comment in the chat box or in the order of service. Let me take a second.
Sorry, the candle just went out. How awful.
That's okay.
There must be a draft in here. Ready.
In honor of those we have known and loved in the past, in recognition of the gifts and sacrifices they have made on our behalf, and in our sincere hopes that we may be worthy of their memory, we light our candles, we give our thanks, and we offer our prayers. The opening words come from Wayne B. Arneson, entitled Prayer for Memorial Day. Spirit of life, we enter into this season of Memorial Day, surrounded by such a cloud of witnesses. We remember, first of all, the women and men who are currently serving in the armed forces, and we pray for their safe return. We also acknowledge that there are women and men who will not return, as we grieve their passing in the daily paper. We pause to honor their service and their sacrifice. We also pause this hour to give thanks for all the women and men who have served in the nation's armed services. Those who have not served cannot fully imagine the experience of war. But we do know what war's aftermath and the toll that it can take on the human heart. This day remembers and acknowledges loss, and so we do remember those whom we have loved and lost. We hold their names and their faces in our mind's eye. We recall the gifts they gave to us through the strength of their being, the depth of their love, and the courage of their dying, and the fullness of their living. In the holy quiet of this hour, their names surround us, and they live with us in blessed memory. May we remain together in silence as a tribute to all that they have meant to us. Amen. And now we will have a musical interlude.
I'm just a poor wayfaring stranger, traveling through this world below. There's no sickness, toil, no danger in that bright land to which I go. I'm going there to see my father and all my loved ones who've gone home. I'm just going over Jordan. I'm just going over home. If you recognize that, that was the traditional hymn, spiritual, traditional song that was highlighted in the signature song of the recent movie 1917, portraying the struggles of those who fought in World War I. And 1917 was one of many movies that have come out in recent years depicting the different stories of war. There was Dunkirk, The Darkest Hour, Hacksaw Ridge, American Sniper, War Horse, Inglorious Bastards, Letter from Iwo Jima, Saving Private Ryan, and Apocalypse Now, The English Patient. The list goes on and on and on and on. That's because Hollywood discovered that war stories are probably the single greatest generator of powerful stories of all time. Not just Hollywood, but writers forever. It's the ultimate conflict, you understand, not just between its geopolitical rivals, its protagonist and antagonist, but from the human experience, up close or from afar. The myriad faces and facets, the triumphs, the tears and the tragedies, the valor and the violence, the courage and the cowardice. It paints a broad palette of human drama. Not just of stories told, but of those silenced as well. Those who came home, those who didn't. Those who found love, and those who lost it. War stories, no matter what war, hold tight the emotional truths inside them. Some made of fact, some made of fiction, some made of a little of both, and some never told. The mother or the wife who got a knock on the door to be handed a telegram that would change her life forever. The bullet that struck a tree where just a few seconds before a soldier was resting his head. A helping hand offered to a wounded soldier from another who wore the enemy's uniform. The nurse who by sense of duty is called to help out on the front lines only to realize sometimes there's little she can do, or he, and they have to let someone die. On this Memorial Day, we once called Decoration Day, to decorate the graves of those who died in service to this nation. We tell and remember the stories of war and the stories of all those who have been touched and changed by it. Steve Pasenier was a second-generation Hungarian boy who grew up on Toledo's Birmingham neighborhood area, a few blocks from the famous Tony Pacos, just off Console. You may know it. He grew up in the 1920s in that very immigrant-rich area. He found himself, like so many others of his era, ready to serve his country when duty called at the outbreak of World War II. It meant not just going to war, but meant being away from the woman of his dreams, Donna Bungard of Toledo. Well, he met Donna at Toledo's then popular Trianon Ballroom. Steve and Donna became engaged. Then Steph, as she called him, was shipped off to the Third Army to Italy at Anzio Beach in January of 1944. There he would witness some of the worst and bloodiest fighting of the war, and with heavy casualties on both sides. Steve was in the thick of it, and to pass the time, he wrote letters, but he used more than just words. He had a talent for art, and his letters he sent home were sent by V-mail, which were hand-drawn sketches with illustrations. Something he had a talent for. He learned to do that at Macomber High School in Toledo. His letters soon became his refuge, his canvas, and his favorite subject was always his love, Donna. I had an opportunity to talk with Magda Pacente, that was Stephen's granddaughter, who told me in an interview last year, it was amazing that he would always portray his sweetheart as the classic idealized sweater girl. He drew scenes that would depict her looking out a window, thinking of him with hearts all her own. He sent those love sonnets by V-mail. By the way, if you don't know, V-mail was short for victory mail. It was actually a quick way for soldiers on the front to send a quick one-page message to a loved one. They would basically bundle them all up and then send them to somewhere in New York, to a post office box, and then distribute them across the country. Well, Steph sent hundreds of them. Not just to his beloved Donna, but also to his parents and family members and friends. He was a clever artist and sometimes humorous. No doubt those V-mails made a lot of people smile, but not all were happy pictures. Many soldiers who were holding tightly on to long-distance relationships like Stephen, well, the weight and the uncertainty could be harrowing, not knowing what your girl was doing back home. Stephen's V-mails were caricatures sometimes of himself, with tears running down his cheeks. She thinks her grandfather's insecurity was probably influenced by all the other soldiers sometimes who got those Dear John letters. There were also many times Stephen would draw caricatures of other soldiers in his company, and he never drew battle scenes or anything desolate or warlike. Many of his drawings were just landscapes of the nearby countryside or buildings, and his granddaughter told me she believes that was his escape from the ugliness of war. It's where he wanted. But when the war finally ended, Stephen did come home back to Toledo. Within a month, he married that woman he loved. He and Donna stayed together 50 years until his death in 1995. Granddaughter says he just wanted to have a safe and happy life. And despite his obvious talent for art, he actually didn't turn it into a career. He worked at a chemical factory in Toledo, moved to Point Place, and raised 2 children. He did continue art, though, as a love or a hobby. He painted, did pen and ink sketches, and even produced a Hungarian coloring book for kids. Magda told me she thought it was important for Hungarian American children to have a better grasp on Hungarian traditions and cultures. Another local person who ended up in Italy's Anzio Beach in 1944 didn't carry a weapon of bullets or bombs, but carried a weapon of healing. Her name was Elsie Perch. She was a nurse, born as Elsie Getz in Indiana, moved to Toledo as a young woman to study nursing at the old Robinwood Hospital. She answered her Patriot's call to duty in December of 1942, a year after Pearl Harbor to the day. She enlisted in the Army Nurses Corps. Within months, she was on the front with the troops in North Africa. She said she spent many long months there and many harrowing moments. She remembers vividly lying in her bunk one night under heavy German bombardment. Without warning, something tore a hole in the tent and sliced into the ground next to her. It was a piece of metal shrapnel, 2.5-inch shard of metal. And she knew how lucky and blessed she was, and she carried that metal home with her. And she kept it in her scrapbook for the rest of her life. In February of 1944, she was transferred to the 33rd Field Hospital at Anzio Beach in Italy, where the fighting was at its most fierce. 6 nurses had already been killed in the field hospital, and she was sent to replace one of them. She called Anzio a front without a back when she was in a Blade interview recently, or back in 2008. The beachhead, she said, was 18 miles long and 9 miles deep, and they were surrounded by Germans the whole time. She recalls in a Veterans History Project interview that, quote, "We were under fire, air raids, shells, and so forth most of the time. They worked in foxholes and trenches covered with a tent. The shelling was continuous. Death was all around. Fear was constant." She said she recalled hundreds of dying young soldiers. And she said sometimes there was just little you could do for them, but to offer them compassion and morphine to ease the pain. She said she wondered on Earth, she wondered what she'd gotten herself into when she signed up for this duty. But she said she sustained her courage by thinking of the sacrifices of all those men she treated. Elsie, by the way, also found something else in war. She found love. During the depths of those dark days, she would lift herself up with the light of romance, holding a long-distance relationship. You can see there with Dan Perch, another nurse she had met in nurses' school in Toledo so many years before. He too was on the front lines elsewhere. They tried to see each other as often as they could, and then finally, after the war, they made their life together in Rossford. Elsie would go on to become a nursing instructor at Mercy's Nursing School in Toledo and talked often of her experiences and shared with others what she remembered. You know, it's said that even after decades of recollections of those harrowing moments that she suffered and endured during the times of war, it would bring tears to her eyes, even 60 years later. Elsie passed away in 2008 at the age of 88. In this time of pandemic, we pay tribute right now to the nurses and doctors and medical staff on the front lines of war. And it's always good to remember this is not the first time these soldiers of healing have faced an enemy that could kill them in their gestures of humanity and mercy. It seems for whatever their nuanced reasons, whether it was altruism, patriotism, humanitarianism, or maybe a sense of adventurism, it might have been an amalgam of all, they do come forward to take care of those who fight and fall, and we are truly blessed that they do. It seems as though every war has inspired the better angels of those among us. And so it was in 1918. Not only did the world face the last great pandemic of influenza, but was confronting a brutal war in Europe, the one we now call World War I, a war that had three adversaries. It had the Axis nations led by the Kaiser in Germany. It had the allies of Great Britain and France, and of course the US. And the greatest enemy of all, the flu. It was the real killer. It didn't care what uniform you wore or what flag you fought under. It was everywhere. Some soldiers never even made it to the battlefield. Army camps around the country were filled with thousands of young recruits at that point, training for warfare against an enemy they could see, only to be vanquished by an enemy they couldn't. The influenza was brutal, lethal. At Camp Sherman, south of Chillicothe, south of Columbus, at Chillicothe, the toll was stunning. When that second wave of virus hit in 1918, thousands of recruits at that camp died from it. And for a while, more soldiers were being killed by the virus than were being sent to the trenches in France. And once there, they couldn't hide. The virus was just as lethal in Europe as it was America. And strangely, as reports poured in daily of soldiers and sailors dying from either the flu or from sheer violence of the war itself, it seems American men, young women, did not shrink from heading to the eye of the storm. One of those who answered the call is this woman you see here, Clara Edith Ayers. She was from Seneca County, a little hamlet you may know called Attica. She became a nurse after the death of her husband in 1906. She had been, they ran a grocery store. He passed away and she decided to become a nurse at that point, moved to Chicago, went to nursing school, and was working there for 10 years. And in 1917, she joined the Red Cross Nurses Corps that had been asking for young nurses to join the war effort. Clara was not really young. She was 37 years old at that point. And she'd been working as a nursing instructor in Chicago. She was immediately assigned to work in France. She traveled to New York City, where she boarded the SS Mongolia, a mail steamship that was repurposed for war. That ship set sail in May of that year, just a month after the president had declared war on Germany. And on May 20th, the ship's crew was running a practice firing of the Mongolia's weapons. Mrs. Ayers and Helen Burnett Wood, another enlisted Red Cross nurse, were standing on the deck near the gun when a shell exploded. They were both killed. Mrs. Ayers struck in the temple by a brass fragment, killing her on impact. She became the first American nurse to die in World War I, likely the first American civilian to die following the U.S.'s official entry into the war. The newspapers all carried the story about the unfortunate Mrs. Ayers, the nurse who died on her way to war. After that, the story fell into the dusty corners of history. She got no medals. She got no honors at the time. Red Cross nurses were not recognized. Remember, they weren't a member of the military in World War I. They weren't recognized for military positions. So Clara Edith Ayers never got a proper military funeral or even a marked gravestone by the government. There's one of the newspaper stories there. In 2017, the Attica Historical Society held a memorial ceremony for Mrs. Ayers at the Attica Fairgrounds, where a marker has been placed now in the fallen nurse's honor. We also understand there's a marker in Chicago at the Chicago School of Nursing, and that there's also a new grave marker where she is buried and laid to rest in Attica. So finally, after all these years, she is recognized. Clara Ayers' story is one that underscores the obvious that, well, war is not often fair. It deals death and injury capriciously with little warning and for no good reason. And that's one reason why on Memorial Day, we do say thanks and acknowledge those who put themselves in harm's way. Carl Winsler for Toledo is someone who did get some thanks from the community, and as well he should have. He returned home from the Battle of the Bulge in World War II without 2 legs and an arm. Winsler, a native of Archbald, Ohio, like many men his age, answered the country's call at the beginning of the war. He was assigned to the 26th Infantry Division. He was made a supply sergeant and put in charge of an equipment shed in Europe, never really having to face any of the frontline brutality of the war. But then his grandson told me, Dr. Greg DeRhodes down in Fremont, said his granddad heard the call of battle. He heard that some of his buddies were surrounded by Germans, so he got a Jeep out of the equipment shed, drove out to the front lines to rescue them. He drove 6 of them to foxholes. He put 2 wounded men on the hood of his Jeep, and he drove them back to safety. He earned the Silver Star for that. Then the following winter, as the Allied forces were trying to stop the Germans' final offensive in this deadly Battle of the Bulge, Winsler again found himself in harm's way. After suffering a severe hand wound, he was hit by shrapnel from a landmine that severed the rest of his hand and arm, blew off his leg and part of the other, and Carl Winsler became one of the war's first triple amputees. After initial treatment and rehab at the Army Hospital in Battle Creek, Michigan, Winsler finally returned home to a hero's welcome. A Toledo Blade campaign helped raise more than $20,000 for the young veteran. And there you can see Carl Shrapner in this picture right here. He's with his wife, Elizabeth, Betty as she was called, and one of their children. And he's holding up actually one of the pieces of shrapnel they dug from his body. That was taken June of 1945, shortly after his return while he was rehabbing in Battle Creek. Well, they started the campaign in Toledo called Home for a Hero. A house that was going to be specifically designed to accommodate Carl's physical need was built on Talmadge Road, just south of Monroe Street, just fairly close to what we now know as the Franklin Park Mall. Carl Winsler, with the help of Toledoans, started college at the University of Toledo with the eventual goal of becoming a lawyer. He and his wife, Betty, even had 2 more children. And life, despite some hardships, was going well. Winsler was described as a happy and an inspirational person who liked to use his sense of humor to make people smile. He often visited local VA hospitals to visit the wounded and boost their spirits. But then in 1950, life took another tragic turn. In October, Carl, driving that specially equipped van that allowed him to drive, he was on his way home from college classes when he suffered a fatal heart attack and died in his driveway. The shock was sudden and the community was saddened. Carl was only 31 years old when he died. The house, by the way, still stands on Talmadge Road, the home for a hero. Carl, the hero, is not far away. At the cemetery right across the street is where Carl Winsler and his wife, Elizabeth, are laid to rest. War is never fair. It is always confusing. It's what we call the fog of war. Dateline Toledo, June 10th, 1945, Zora Hammy of Miami Street in Toledo, 4 months after getting word that her husband, the father of their 2 children, Private Paul Hammy, had been killed in action in Europe. She got another telegram, the War Department informing her they made a mistake. Her husband was alive and well and was coming home, being shipped back. He had been found, liberated from a German POW camp. The Blade had an interview with them, and Paul Hammy Jr., 3 years of age, the little boy, said, "My daddy's coming home on a big ship." Daddy is coming home. War does offer us a banquet of emotion and the unexpected. Take the story of Albert Hassenzoll. He was 101st Airborne captain, saw heavy combat as a paratrooper, wounded numerous times, won 4 Purple Hearts and 2 Bronze Stars. He was the very definition of what we call a brave American hero. He had many stories to tell, but one that he always told interviewers later in his life was one of his most haunting experiences. He was involved in D-Day, for example. They parachuted in. He had been severely wounded. And he said a, quote, curious thing happened that I'll never forget. I was lying on Utah Beach on a stretcher. A storm came up. I didn't have the strength to pull the blanket back over me that the wind had blown off. An arm came across my body and tucked the blanket up tenderly around me. The person who did it was a wounded German prisoner lying next to him, also on a stretcher with mangled legs. Hassenzoll says, we just looked at each other. I tried to thank him with my eyes, and I think he tried to say, you're welcome, with his. That incident has stayed with me all of my years. The unexpected milk of human kindness, even in the time of hate and killing and war, is not an unusual experience, although sometimes it's not well known. The final story this morning dates back to the Civil War. I was able to find this in an obscure newspaper while doing some research. This newspaper carried stories written by the veterans of the Civil War. This one from Henry Fistel of the 100th Ohio Volunteer Infantry, which was involved in some very heavy fighting in Georgia at a place called Utoy Creek near Atlanta. A lot of people took casualties, especially Company G. A lot of those fellows were from Ottawa County. It happened in August of 1864. Henry Fistel wrote this article in 1880 in Recollection. Let me narrate the experience of a private from our company, G, that you may remember. Isaac Metzger of Genoa. He was wounded 7 times in both hands, both thighs, and both shoulders. He lay on the field from 1 o'clock August 6th to 1 o'clock August 7th, when he was finally taken up by our men and told his story. He said he lay on the field in the hot, scorching sun when a Johnny came up and stole his boots. Isaac begged him not to do that, but to give him a sip of water. But the Johnny replied he needed the boots and had no water. And later that night, yet another Johnny came and took his hat, despite his pitiful protest not to do so, because he said it was all he had to protect him from the sun and keep his eyes from burning up. At last, however, in the person of a third Johnny, came a good Samaritan, who knelt by his side and gave him some water and prayed to God to help ease his suffering. So moved by this kindness that Isaac asked the Johnny to take him into the rebel lines and care for him, but the Johnny said it would be better if he waited for his own comrades. They could take better care of him. He gave him another drink of water, moved him into the shade of some bushes. The next day, said Henry Thistle, we succeeded in getting Isaac behind our lines. And he told his story and expressed himself as feeling fine and first-rate spirits. He thought he would be able to get home, but it was a delusive hope, for he died that evening at sunset. He was one of the noblest boys in the regiment and will never be forgotten. Henry Thistle, Company G, 100th Ohio Volunteer Infantry. War stories, sometimes big, sometimes small, sometimes remembered, some forgotten. They're not mirrors of what happened, but often prisms that reflect their own truth from many different angles, the angles of those who experienced them. Amen.
Thank you, Lou. That was powerful. Thank you. Now more than ever, we are counting on your pledge payments and donations to help sustain and strengthen this congregation that is so important to all of us, supporting our efforts to be a community of love, truth, justice, and service. Please click on the link and be sure to select the correct designation on the drop-down box when you donate. Thank you. During the offertory, we'll have some music from Megan. And now we will sing hymn number 161, Peace, the Perfect Word.
perfect word is sounding like a never spoken. What oceans of our mountains to the mountain waters. Toiling centuries have struggled the stony way. Just as the drops of spirit winds aloft to behold for our lost brothers. All the hopes of subject peoples, through the turns of the oppressed. Life beyond our hopes, our visions, we can never stay or rest.
And now Lou Hebert will give our closing words. Once he's unmuted. He's currently muted.
I'm sorry, it won't let me unmute. Lou, can you press unmute on your screen?
There we go. I've unmuted myself. In Flanders fields, the poppies blow. Between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky, the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead short days ago. We lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw, the torch be yours to hold it high. If you break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields row.
Thank you. Now, please join me in reading the words for extinguishing our chalice that can be found in the comments in the chat box or in the order of service, which is also posted as a comment in the chat box. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of integrity. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. After the service, we will turn on all videos and mics. Feel free to stay in Zoom and chat with your fellow MVUUC members and friends for our coffee hour. Please be patient, as turning on the cameras must be done one at a time, and it can take a few minutes to get to everyone, but unmuting should be pretty quick. And now, let us sing Spirit of Life, hymn number 123, for our closing song. You can find the words as a comment in the Zoom chat box or in the order of service, which is also posted as a comment in the Zoom chat box.
You mean participants?
Yeah, the one where you can show all the participants at the bottom.
In my heart, but stirring far from that. Oh, in the wind, oh, it's sweet. Oh, in the land, giving life, the stream of goodness. Fruits bearing grass, rings of green, spindles of life, unto me,
Thank you all for coming today. Now we will have our coffee hour, so feel free to stay and we will unmute microphones so that you can all speak to one another. Lisa, you might also want to stop the recording at this point.